context to
No,
where
it's
you're
good.
going? All right. So a little more about myself. So I came from the publishing background. My first job out of college was with a publisher at the American Institute of Physics. That's where I started actually using MarkLogic and continued on that path at Condé Nast, and then focusing mostly on metadata standards with Univision and some independent consulting before I've come to Progress MarkLogic. So talking about one of the main issues that we all deal with across multiple verticals is unstructured content. So unstructured data is a huge untapped resource in a lot of different industries. So whether you're in pharmaceuticals or financial institutions, or even in some of the manufacturing verticals, a lot of content is produced outside of the traditional relational databases. However, most of the decisions, about 90% of those decisions, are made only on structured data, while about 80% of the data that is in your organization is unstructured. And these are direct numbers that come from the IBC, from extensive research across multiple verticals. While you're answering most of your decisions on that 90% of data, why? Because all the tooling is there, right? So you have plenty of BI tools, you have relational databases that have been around for many, many years that can handle that data. So what is the big difference between structured data and unstructured data? Well, structured data is the typical things that you see in like an Excel spreadsheet or a report that you generate. So numbers, strings, dates, all that interesting stuff that you can run analytics on really quickly. The other 80% is a huge untapped resource, but it's hard to get that information out of there. So it's things like emails, PDFs, Word documents, social media posts, all that information that's out in various silos across your enterprise internally, as well as external resources where you may want to pull that information in from for additional insights. So we're going to go through some of the patterns that we've used in the publishing industry over the last several decades that could help with that 80%. Steve, you want to talk a little bit about our time?
So, as James said, Steve Ingram, I lead solution architecture for Semaphore. And Semaphore was created to make sense of structured data. So in terms of our roadmap, we're a little bit younger than MarkLogic, so we were formed in 2006. And we get the kind of the little brother relationship, and it kind of has carried on. But we've been partners since 2012. First joint customer, the Semaphore Cloud, which is now part of the Progress Data Cloud, was built on MarkLogic, and we have very, very many customers. And it's the combination is Semaphore is creating the metadata that is going into MarkLogic, and that's really kind of the relationship we've always had. Obviously, we were acquired in 2021, and then Progress acquired both of us in 2023. And I think if you were in the session yesterday morning, Matthew outlining the whole Progress Data Platform, combining the best of both. So we, as Drew said, there are a lot of patterns in publishing that are reusable. So if we sort of go through sort of the main ones, we have sort of all publishers have larger. Sorry, do you want to? You can do it. You can do this one. Okay. Yeah, no
sure.
It was on my list.
So jumping into some of the use patterns, digital archives is a huge use pattern that is transferable across all the verticals. So what a digital archive really is fitting data that's in different shapes, sizes, providers, quality, in a centralized location where you can find it. So in the publishing world, you can think of a publisher has hundreds of magazines in different topical areas. They're all different editors. They may be different content formats. So when you're dealing with sports statistics, it's different than a news article being published, right? So bringing that data together in a digital archive allows folks to ensure that it's not lost. In a lot of institutions, that data could just be sitting on a hard drive under somebody's desk, or in a remote server or a SharePoint site. And bringing that information together really allows you to unlock things and lead to the next use pattern, which is, come on, click, data discovery. So data discovery and search is one of the biggest items that a lot of publishers deal with because they have vast amounts of information and they need to get that information to researchers or consumers as quickly as possible, as well as in a targeted format. So things like Google-like searching. A lot of people don't come in and write SQL statements to go find the top news article, right? They're going to jump into a search box and just type in some keywords that they're interested in to find. As well as semantic publishing, which has been a very large trend in the last 20 years, where you're categorizing and organizing that data in your archives and content management systems in topical areas. So you'll apply semantics and key concepts to your information where you could search experiences, predefined navigation paths to content, so you can get that user to that information as quick as possible. So for example, if you're interested in elections for 2024, well, there's other subtopics in that semantic tree, so things like voting and campaign finances and things like that. You want to be able to find all that information as quickly as possible with any content that has been that's been tagged with that. However, all that content sitting in just a repository is not doing anything. So syndication patterns is where you would get information to the right people at the right time in a secured fashion. So the content is the lifeblood of a publishing organization, right? It's the main thing that they monetize, along with the impressions on top of that content, whether it's driving subscriptions for users paying for that content or attached ad revenue that comes from viewing that information. So the final component to that is monetization. So when you want to package that content up and send it to the providers, you're syndicating it in a secure fashion, but you want to make sure that you're coming up with the right products to send to those folks. In terms of monetization, one thing that happens is there may be a popular world event that happens. So the Olympics just passed by. Maybe you're tracking an athlete across their career. You have all that information in your digital archives. You can now discover it. You can discover it really quickly because you have great semantic tagging against it. And then you can package this information and resell it. So you're reusing information and content that you already constructed in your organization in other ways and leading to additional revenue that's coming into the organization. So how did we, at MarkLogic and Progress and Semaphore, address this across other verticals? So in our early days, we focused on a lot of government information management as well as the publishing sector. But as we discussed, those use patterns seem pretty repeatable across other verticals, especially in this world of unstructured content. So these digital archives, for example, help R&D organizations retain their valuable knowledge when employees are leaving, retiring, as well as not having to rerun expensive tests or get new market research reports. The data discovery and search paradigms have helped the financial services. We heard a great presentation yesterday about ISO payments, right? That's a lot of unstructured content and semi-structured content that needs to be discovered quickly in cases of auditing events or fraud analysis and things like that. Syndication processes have helped our federal clients get the right information to the right people at the right time without any data leaks or breaches. And then monetization principles have led to a lot of our pharmaceutical customers and new monetizations of content because you may be tracking different adverse events on these reports and see other potential utilizations for these pharmaceutical drugs.
So, in the words of the esteemed business leader Jennifer Aniston, here comes the science part. Firstly, obligatory Gartner slide. Gartner slide. Back in 2008, Gartner did a piece of work around what they call the hyperconnected enterprise. So they're looking at the sort of evolution of decision making from nicely siloed systems through to what we're dealing with in the present day, where everything is massively distributed. Now, the sort of main themes around this is that as ecosystems widen, everything becomes more complex, understanding decreases, and this is sort of due, at a basic sort of level, to sort of think about terminology. So if I said the word gas, how many people think that's what you put in your car? Yeah. How many people think it's something that's floating around and usually invisible? Go on, Clive, put your hand up. How many people think it's actually both? It's floating around and you put it in your car? Absolutely. So just a simple word. Even if you're thinking about petrol, or what you put in your car, Americans call it gas, we call it petrol. If I was an analyst, I call it petroleum. If I'm in the logistics industry, I'm going to call it 3YE1207, 1270, sorry. And if I'm a chemist, I'm going to use the formula. All the same way of referring to exactly the same thing. And if you're working in a hyperconnected situation, then these terms, you can't reuse a document if you don't understand the vocabulary or the terminology. I wanted to see where Gartner were going with this, and they haven't sort of stressed the hyperconnectedness, but they're now sort of turning their attention internally. So this is the latest view, well, it's 2023, and now they're looking at how internally organizations are trying to sort of reuse the information in there, and again, it's the same sort of problem. You have to make certain that people can reuse all your assets, especially unstructured content. IDC, meanwhile, they're getting on the bandwagon. They're looking at how you can make better decisions using external data. Now, the pharmaceutical industry are leading the way on this, and since last 8-10 years, have something called the Fair Data Initiative. So, because pharmaceutical companies live and die by the reusing the assets of their R&D staff, you're reusing the knowledge that they have internally. They've developed this approach, which is called FAIR, and for data to be, all data, as far as they're concerned, should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And by definition, that means they need to have some degree of consistency. Otherwise, you can't, teams can't reuse. Even if they're in the same geography, they won't be able to necessarily reuse the same data. And by reusing that data, they will see competitive advantage over companies that can't. Now, there's a catch and there's an elephant in the room, in that any worker, any knowledge worker, has got enough on their plate doing the job they're paid for. They're not going to do anything extra to actually enable fair data, enable data reuse. It's not a reasonable request. So we're going to come on to that more later, but in the meantime, here's Drew.
So a lot of these applications and new initiatives have been powered by knowledge graphs. So knowledge graphs have been a popular go-to pattern in the last decade or so. And really what it is a pattern of connected information, facts, whether it's an object, an event, a situation, where you have clear relationships and understand the interconnections between them. So with MarkLogic and Semaphore, we've been utilizing these patterns, and with the two products together, it has been a great area for us because this data comes in from all different areas, right? Documents, unstructured content, whether it's photos, videos, long-form articles, reports, emails. We can manage that content in MarkLogic. So we have that rich, robust information with the lineage and all the additional provenance that's attached to that to understand that content on its own. From there, we can also bring in data that comes from your traditional relational databases that start to fill this graph out. But what interconnects all this and makes sense of it is the semantic layer. we can start to define our ontologies, taxonomies, and knowledge models in Semaphore, and really describe our high-level business layers, as well as the lower-level conceptual and technical layers of our data, that we can interconnect that information and start to build these relationships of facts and data. So by providing this, this particular pattern of knowledge graphs, we unlock an additional value of insights where we see relationships not only directly to the first level, but cascading throughout other items within there. Similar to the example that I talked about earlier, where I'm looking for content about elections. Well, some information may not mention the word election directly, but it talks about campaign finances or particular ballot situations and things like that. So we can apply those patterns and traversal through the knowledge graph to get that information in all these other verticals using these knowledge models. So the question is, how do we get there? Where are we now? And how do we start to build a system like this? You may have seen in John's presentation yesterday, but a lot of traditional approaches are application-centric. So you come up with a new initiative, you're going to, say, your CMS and your ERP system, you want to start pulling that data together. So you start to connect individual APIs, point-to-point applications to calls to get that data. Well, as it progresses, it gets a little more complicated. You add a new app in, well, that's a lot more connections. And then eventually you're sitting on thousands and thousands of connections that are extremely, extremely difficult to maintain, potential security breaches because you're securing all the information at the edges on each of these points, and it becomes unmanageable. So how we position this is to go to a data-centric approach. You start to build that information in an archive, in a data hub, as some folks have been doing over the years. And that lends itself to securing that information at the data layer, so you ensure that the right people can see it. You start to build harmonized views of this information where you can start to create a 360, right? So you may not get all the information from your CRM system about that customer. It's really a combination of information from the CRM, maybe from the ERP on their order management, on what they've started purchasing, or logistics on how that content has got to them. So you can start to really build a robust model. So as you have may heard in previous presentations, the Progress Data Platform allows you to kind of unlock that additional information by bringing in all these different siloed data, no matter the shape or size, connecting it in, starting to create this harmonized metadata and views on top of the information that we're gathering, connecting it, and then finally consuming it, and whether it's in a search-based application, whether it's coming out in our traditional BI tools now, because we have the capabilities of projecting that information out of the system directly into what your Tableau or Power BI expects, or even just feeding in other downstream systems to partners or other systems that want to use that data. So some of the key capabilities is that connected data aspects where you can start to pull in that information from various silos into the system. The tooling around to build a harmonized view. As we know, all these systems have different levels of quality, different levels of fidelity on the information. So you want to start to build and develop that harmonized understanding of that content. Semantic modeling and classifications to really add additional metadata for tracking, for classifications to get to that information as quickly as possible. Putting that data in context, meaning that it has that information from other systems, whether it's technical information that comes to the systems or editorial information that comes from the consumers and users of those systems. uniform security where you're actually securing the data and ensuring that even in a particular record, you can see the information for a purchase, but you might not see the person's PII information, where they live, or their credit card information and things like that. Reference data and metadata, adding in that information, and then finally building out applications where you can visually consume this information in a new way. So that's a lot about the tooling, but what about the workflow? How do we get there? So this data comes in from a lot of different systems, whether it's relational stores, mainframes, file systems, SharePoint sites, and they don't conform usually to any standard or same shape. When you're trying to cram that into a relational database, you put all the design up front to build this giant schema that you think it'll fit everything in. And that typically becomes a large waste of time because a schema is evolve quickly through changing business needs and application development cycles. So what we do is bring in that raw data and we index the content itself as well as the structure of that. So we can start to immediately search things, we can find that information in that vast sea, and then start to identify patterns on top of that data, identify things that we want to use in our end state applications or APIs or reporting. So we follow a pattern called enveloping, where we take that data and encapsulate it, where we start to build that harmonized view without losing any of the fidelity of the original data. So we can then start to say, oh, well, we want to ensure that first name and last name and people's addresses are in a consistent format for our customer 360, for example. So we'll start to harmonize the information into those metadata buckets and store the original content in that envelope. So we can now start to search with specificity and consistency against those fields. We can start to generate reports off of those. But if a new use case comes up and we want to find it, we still have that existing data from those other systems to quickly target it if we need to.
Steve? So there's two sides to this. So there's the management of the data and management of the metadata, and bringing that in centrally and allowing it to be reused. But then there's also the key point about managing the knowledge. So how do we make sure we pull in the knowledge that's being used and allow that to be reused? And that's that's where Semaphore comes in on that side. And quite often, people say, when we talk about Semaphore, they say, I don't have a taxonomy, I don't have an ontology. And the answer in every single case is you do. You just don't call it a taxonomy and an ontology. So in many situations, the information is scattered around the organization. In some cases, some organizations have standardized taxonomies. Life sciences, pharma, very strong in that sort of area. In many other industries, there are industry vocabularies, industry definitions that can be reused, but there will be definitions inside an organization. And so these can all be, Semaphore has tools to pull all these in and then allow them to be centrally managed and, more importantly, reused. But even in situations where an organization generally doesn't have a taxonomy, and again, I find this really difficult because businesses communicate using concepts, they're managed using relationships, and so therefore there is an ontology in use. It's a question of how do we capture it. Even if there isn't one codified, and generally there are in spreadsheets, even if there isn't one codified, then we can now use things like ChatGPT. If you were at Lance's session earlier on yesterday, use ChatGPT to make recommendations. And that's relevant if your terminology is relevant to the outside world. If it isn't, and you're a MarkLogic customer, then Semaphore can actually start to mine data in MarkLogic, start to surface terms, so new noun phrases that might be coming through, terms that appear alongside terms already in your model. And so you can actually start to use your data to actually start to enrich the model. Now, ideally, it would be a case of press a button and it manufactures a taxonomy for you. We aren't there yet, but you can definitely use your internal content to flesh out your taxonomy. Your knowledge model. Naughty. And the other side of the equation is sort of historically when people are looking at knowledge management, the idea was that you got some poor librarian to understand everything about a business, and it was their job to maintain the library and maintain the knowledge models. But with Semaphore, we adopted a collaborative approach. So in the same way that sort of logic and the envelope pattern is all about reusing the content that's out there, the data that's out there, we will pull the information out of people's heads. Well, pull's not the right word, but allow people to contribute their knowledge, their expertise into the knowledge model, and then all the librarian has to do is just, make sure it's clean and it's good and it's reusable. So it becomes a much more collaborative exercise. And it's kind of a sort of virtuous circle, because the more people contribute to the knowledge model, the more data they have available for their own processes. Now, I said earlier on that people don't, people are fundamentally busy, so they can't, you can't require them to fill out lots of extra fields if they aren't relevant to their business. So where Semaphore plays in that situation is once you have the knowledge model and knowledge models managed, regularly updated, you actually want to use them. And the classic way of using that is to provide additional metadata into the envelope pattern from the knowledge model, either through the process of classification, where we say these are the concepts in your knowledge model that need to be attached to this document or record, or fact extraction, we're actually surfacing things out of the text that can then be passed down to MarkLogic and become available as actionable metadata. So, first step is to capture the knowledge. Second step is actually make it usable, and then over to Joe again.
So we brought this data in, harmonized and made it in a clean format for consumption. We've went through Semaphore in terms of tagging things and ensuring that we have all the proper information on those records to discover them in an easier way. So now how do we consume it? So one of the most common ways is building search applications and information that presents this data in different ways, right? So, for example, this is a Claims 360 application built with our new Fast Track application, where we can start to search that that information from a Google-like search. We understand, and we're particularly looking for, say, sedans that were in an accident on Broadway. We can search for that in free text. We can also do quick aggregations against it and present that information to a user in another way. So maybe they can start to do, well, statistically, sedans have a lot of accidents. We have a lot of open cases for those. What's going on here? And then on the graph side, on these interconnected bits of information, maybe there's a big cluster in the middle of a single individual filing a lot of claims. What's going on there? Are they just accident prone? Is this a potential fraud ring? So we can start to delve down and look at the data in different ways and through different lenses to understand the information and the processes that are actually happening in a clearer and more concise way. So this is all well and good. It's interesting to see how the sausage is made, but our customers have been doing this for a very long time. So customers, one of our leading pharmaceutical customers, have applied these patterns to improve their logistics, ensuring that the information and drugs that they're delivering are getting there to the right places on time, as well in the right conditions and circumstances. They help drive their R&D initiatives through capturing this information in the archives and being able to search it. Our friends over at ADM, their R&D organization has a tremendous amount of research data over 100 years of information, nearing 19 terabytes of data. That information was siloed in different organizations across the globe. There's definitely areas where people would retire. Their information was maybe in emails, maybe it was in a SharePoint site. How do you get to that information? By creating these archives, they were able to do a lot of cost savings. They were exponentially increase their efficiency and saving multiple hours a week for their researchers and executives looking for information.
Cool. Good work. Originally I was going to ask a question about who do you think our biggest publisher is from a Semaphore perspective. And even when we had the industry slides up there, I don't think anybody reckoned that it would be a car manufacturer, but it actually is. So these guys are big. They have a program to manage defects to reduce costs. If I'm driving one of their cars, I think I'd rather they manage defects to keep me alive, but you know, hey, whatever. So it's all about processing safety reports. Now, obviously, the government, US government issues safety reports on cars on a regular basis, but by then it's too late. You know, you don't want to have accidents. You know, you want to try and stop them before they happen. So what they do is they have a team of subject matter experts. They are processing 18 million safety records. Now, these aren't just coming from the government. They're coming from social media. They're coming from mechanics. They're coming from community forums. And they're processing 18 million per day. Now, these are not big records, but that's quite a throughput. But more importantly, what they're doing is they're continually reprocessing them. So as there are things they want to investigate, they will just rechurn through, update their knowledge model, get the contribution from the experts, update the knowledge model, and then rechurn through, reclassify, and then analyze what's coming out. And by finding these problems early, they are saving money as far as they're concerned, but obviously they're keeping people safe. And now I bet that when we said earlier on that everybody's a publisher, everybody's also kind of an author as well. I bet the people who were contributing to the community forums on the cars didn't think they were actually publishing safety briefings, but in fact they were, because we were able to catch those and take action based on those. Then also looking at the professional services industry. So these guys had an army of tax advisors. I have to be fairly careful because they're very sensitive about this application. I've got to try and make sure I don't say enough that you can work out who it is. But they're a global professional services organization right across the whole gamut of industrial services. They have a tax advisory service, so they have an army of tax advisors. These guys have to mine through legal information, they have to mine through legislation, they have to look at sort of previous reports and that kind of thing to come up. So they're actually giving advice to customers. And they were having to do this by working through multiple back-end systems, and this is actually a customer of both Semaphore and MarkLogic historically. So what we can do is use Semaphore to enrich the data, facilitate, make sure they find it. They don't have to spend all their time trawling through different sources. It's one place, it's highly searchable, it's highly discoverable. But more importantly, they can make sure that they are not losing the key pieces. So it's a bit of a needle in a haystack situation. They want to make sure there may well be key information that can actually influence a decision. They want to make sure that is visible to their users. Now, the really interesting thing about this deployment is not so much how it's all being used for, but it's actually how they maintain the knowledge model. So this is an example of very successful collaborative knowledge model management. So they have a taxonomist, she's a librarian, she's got a number of other functions which she also maintains the knowledge model, but she's not updating it at all herself. That's coming from the army of tax advisors they have, and also the guys looking after the legal and the legislation material, the input material. So they are able to contribute to the knowledge model. All she needs to do is just corral their suggestions, approve, accept, reject, make sure they're all good and they actually contribute to the overall picture. And then they flow through to the knowledge model, and she does that on a periodic basis. And the fact that she's actually managed to produce 2 children in the last 3 years, and this system is still increasingly effective, kind of goes to the point about you don't need, if you can delegate your knowledge model out to your subject matter experts, you can get all these benefits, and it just becomes effectively a force accelerator. I don't think I gave away who it was. Excellent. Cool. Thank you.
Well, I hope this was informative to everybody, that you can see some of the patterns that the publishing industry pioneered in the early days are definitely repeatable across other verticals. So if you're interested in talking any more about these use cases or patterns, you can grab one of us. Feel free to reach out to us at any time. And that's about it.
Any questions?
Any questions? Sure.
What's much a question more a topic perhaps for Steve. In a lot of the customers where we're working, may or may not have a history of working on ontologies and taxonomies, but they're trying to start from just downloading one from the Pistoia Alliance for life sciences or PubMed for healthcare.
Yeah.
Do you see the same trend in your customers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is around customers trying to make a start on knowledge models by downloading ones at the third party, available from third parties. It's sort of slightly, I'm so hesitating because we always say you can download them from third parties, and you know you can, but in many cases it's a slightly the purpose of the taxonomy, the ontology, is not so much to describe content and describe data and make it usable. It's kind of to define the terms. So we sometimes find people say, "Oh, there is an ontology," and it's really effectively an EDI specification for anybody who dates back as far as I do. So it's basically a message format. It says, you know, a trade will have, you know, a party and an amount and a number of shares, and that really isn't, you know, that's an ontology, but it isn't really a usable knowledge model. And in many situations, we can download these knowledge models, but quite often then you add labels to them, to add additional evidence, additional metadata to the knowledge model to allow it to be used over data. Because kind of historically, the information scientists didn't want to get involved with data because data is dirty and icky and complicated, and actually they'd much rather have decide on a nicely regulated world which they could control. So there is this kind of sort of slight sort of bridge that needs to be crossed. Now, a good approach that and one we encourage is bring down the third-party taxonomy, and then maybe look at actually what can you do, provide additional definitions over the top, and we have something in Semaphore called linked models that make that work really well. So you might bring in you know, a version of an ontology, an ontology, provide some definitions over the top, provide some local richness that allow you then to use that for classification, and then and if another version is released, when you just link that in underneath, take out the first version, your definitions for your existing definitions can be reused, and then if you need to add any additional definitions over new concepts, then they can be done in the model, and you don't lose your you know what you've done previously. So yeah, it's always worth curating these third-party taxonomies just to make certain they are good, usable. And I would also make a call out to this company called WAND. They've been a partner of Semaphore, Smart Logic, for very many years. Now WAND just do foundational taxonomies, but they have a suite of about 40 business vertical and horizontal taxonomies, and these are pretty good starter terms. In fact, the WAND started its, the business was all about just managing taxonomies for large retailers. So, you know, there are downloadable ones, or, well, the WAND library is not very expensive and has very comprehensive. So it's called WAND Inc. I would recommend it if you're looking at getting starting from with taxonomies, that you give them have a look at that website. Does that answer the question, Clive? Or?
Yeah, great.
Cool, thank you.
I'd like to add a little extra tidbit to what Steve said, is that if you look at these external industry standard taxonomies and ontologies that are out there, like KEBI or like the OBO Foundation that posts a lot of them, those have been developed over years and they're huge. So your area of concentration at your organization might not need all 100,000 terms and concepts, right? Some projects you're dealing with may only need a few hundred concepts. And there's also areas within your organization that you can get quickly started with these knowledge models. You have applications that have controlled lists already, maybe your product catalogs or your status management, workflow management systems, and things like that.
So you can do a mix of this external information that comes from the public domain plus your internal knowledge, mix them together, and then curate it to a precise amount of information that you need. Typically, what we see is like any data project, try to boil the ocean, you're not going to get there, right? So start small, focus in on a particular domain area where you are going to bring immediate value, and then continue on adding additional concepts, bringing in additional data sources, melding that together, and classifying.
It sounds like there's a lot of effort involved in the beginning of a project to sort of define a taxonomy, right? How do you make sure that it evolves with new concepts that are coming in?
Yeah. So
Nothing is static, right? I mean, things could change so fast.
yeah, I can. You want to speak to that, Steve?
Yeah,
Okay.
yourself in.
Sure. So the question is, it sounds like it's hard to start off with a knowledge model and keep it consistent and like a living model, right, where it's constantly updated. And so it may seem that it's difficult, but if you focus in like the agile paradigms that you would use in software development, developing your taxonomy, start focusing on a small area, right? So going through the process, whether you're data mining some of your content to come up with a list of terms and curate those down, whether you're starting from one of those external models and bringing it into the system. So you can start small within one of those focused areas, start to contribute to it. One of the things is there's two components on building a knowledge model. One is the development and evolution of it. So in Semaphore you have things like workflow tools like tasks where you can create different versions of it and start to add in additional information into that model so it's not stagnant. You can reach out to your subject matter experts through the knowledge review tool within there and ask them to contribute directly and add to that taxonomy. So that's all the development life cycle of that model, and typically you don't want to use something that's changing rapidly in an end user application, right? So you may be discovering something in one path today, and then an hour later there's a change and now you can't get to that content. So you want to go through a publishing life cycle, right, where you change the change management of the model, understanding where the checkpoints and validations are, and then you publish it out to your consuming applications, whether it's your applications for the classification of the content you can publish it out to, whether it's in publishing it out to your content management system where people are going to use it for tagging. You want to ensure that it's a gated process with validation as well as an intent for use of that model. Does that answer your question?
Just to add in there, what you don't want to do is, as Drew said before, the ocean. You don't need to try and dive down to like a million different levels. In many situations, just the top two bits. You start with the top two. What's your primary category? What are your subcategories for each of those primaries? And then work it out from there. And that's and it's a very iterative process. So yeah, define the top two layers of your taxonomy, classify your content, and then see where documents are sitting. So if you find out that 90% of your documents are 2 or 3 concepts, then flesh out that area. The one thing that is important, as you said in your question, it's about maintaining it. One of my customers, a large financial organisation, actually fired their taxonomist around 3.5 years without updating their knowledge model. But then at the end of those 3.5 years, they realised that it was massively out of date. There were organisations that weren't being referenced and should be referenced, all the rest of it. So follow this example of a professional services company and have a part-time librarian who's just put in your input from subject matter experts. But yeah, make sure that process needs to be continually reviewed. And we're also even looking at can you use the classification results in MarkLogic to actually determine what of your model is being, which bits of your knowledge model is actually firing. Do you have a particular alternative label that you're spending time maintaining, but actually no document ever has those alternative labels. There's no point actually maintaining that, so that can be dropped from the model completely. And that's a start. That's kind of a pattern that's starting to evolve. The semaphore more closely integrated with the data. Historically, semaphores it's stateless. We send this document, we send you the metadata. That's it. We don't have a history of what we've done. But now with MarkLogic, as we classify content from any other system, we can write it into MarkLogic, and then we've got full power of the query language to analyse what we're doing and see where the results are coming.